heart of where innovation, money, and power collide in Silicon Valley and beyond. This is Bloomberg Technology with Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow.
I'm Caroline Hyde at Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York.
And I'm Ed Ludlow, live in Cupertino, here at the Apple campus. Behind me, the Steve Jobs Theatre. This is a special Bloomberg Technology for coverage of Apple's iPhone event.
So much to digest. Coming up on this program, we'll have, of course, that extended coverage on Apple, its product launch, as the company, of course, faces internal chip delays, restrictions in China, and a shifting supply chain. We'll break down everything you need to know, and we'll cover Google's biggest antitrust challenge yet. That's as the Department of Justice and 35 US states sue the search giant, accusing it of maintaining a monopoly over the search market. More details ahead. And we'll hear from Endeavor president, that's Mark Shapiro, as the company completes its takeover of WWE and combines it with UFC to create a newly publicly traded fighting giant. We'll talk the streaming implications, all that and so much more ahead. But first and foremost, we've got to be discussing what's happening in the world of Apple. And this really is an exciting time in terms of the 15 launch. I almost feel we know exactly what to anticipate. We always know our reporting is so strong here at Bloomberg. But there is a lot of headwinds facing Apple. Do you think that we can see the tailwinds today?
Yeah, and it's why the iPhone is everything. That's kind of the key of what we're expecting. 4 variants of the next generation iPhone 15, a base model, an iPhone 15 Plus, and then a Pro and Pro Max. And as you know, Caro, Apple kind of reserves its biggest technological updates for those Pro lines. Higher price point, it raises the average selling price. Is it enough to convince the consumer to upgrade? We know there are tens, if not hundreds of millions of older generation iPhone handsets out there. Are they going to be able to boost volumes, or are they going to rely on higher prices? That's going to be a key question.
And are we going to see revenues start to increase again? This is, of course, the key $200 billion juggernaut of Apple's revenue, that is the phone. Let's dig into it all. We're so pleased to welcome Mark Gurman to the show, of course, who has already kind of braced us for what to expect throughout the announcements. But is it all about getting them to pay a higher price point, Mark?
Certainly, Apple is pushing, like Ed said, its latest features and advancements to the higher end models, right? They're going to be differentiating the Pro models from the non-Pro models more than ever, right? And on top of that, the highest end, the most expensive Pro model, the iPhone 15 Pro Max, is going to have additional features like a periscope camera, which essentially means it can have a much wider range of zoom using hardware. So being able to zoom in double the amount you could on the regular 15 Pro without degrading the quality of the image. So certainly they're pushing people to the top with the better cameras, titanium, and faster performance.
You know, Mark, there's a big emphasis on the higher-end processor for the Pro and Pro Max, right? A17, you've reported about Apple's latest generation processor, additional memory. So there's a compute factor there, but there's also a battery life factor. And then, of course, not of Apple's own volition, a European Union mandate for USB-C. Talk to us about what you've reported on those 2 items.
Yeah, the 3-nanometer chip, this is going to be Apple's first 3-nanometer component. This is a chip manufactured by TSMC. And what 3-nanometer allows is better battery life and better efficiency. So you'll see some battery life upgrades on the 15 Pro and 15 Pro Max because of that. And of course, back to that differentiation point, the higher-end phones will get that A17, whereas the lower end, the 15 and 15 Plus, the 2 entry-level phones, those will both get the A16 chip from the 14 Pro and 14 Pro Max from last year. And in terms of USB-C, all 4 models will get USB-C instead of Lightning. But there is a little bit of a trick here because the Pro models, they're going to get USB-C with faster data transfer speeds, which would be good if you take very high resolution video on the Pro models to connect them to your computer and transfer them over a cable. You'll be able to do that at a much faster rate with some specialized Thunderbolt cables than you would on the regular models. So certainly the talk of today will be how the Pro models are going to have extra bells and whistles to really bring people up to the higher end models.
Great. So all those lightning cables I've been accruing since 2012 are now completely redundant. Thank you to Bloomberg's Mark Gurman. We're just getting started here in Cupertino, and I'm delighted to bring in Creative Strategies Principal Analyst Carolina Milanesi. We will get to the USB-C debate. I think the big discussion we've had on Bloomberg Technology has been there is an unknown number of older generation iPhones out there. If it's the tens of millions or hundreds of millions, we've reported and what we think is coming. Is the technology upgrade enough to spur this genuine upgrade cycle?
I think it is. If all the rumors play out, Mark was talking about moving people to the higher price point. I think there's two markets, right? You have the early adopters and the pro users that can do that, but then you have a huge base of people that have devices that are 4 or 5 years old that need to continue to go on that path. So creating more separation between the pro model and the non-pro model is critical to get those people to move up.
As you know, I focus a lot on the technology from a sort of processor compute standpoint, but actually switching to titanium sides or edges is interesting. Why would that make a difference in the smartphone market?
I can tell you that from just from a consumer perspective, getting into the store and holding one of those new phones is the most tangible expression of the phone being different, right? Weight on something that you use so much during the day makes a difference. It might also invite some people to go to the larger form factor because the weight is no longer the factor that is deciding whether or not you want to carry something that heavy. There's obviously a sustainability story as well linked to titanium. And it'll be interesting to see how far Apple is going to push that sustainability story today.
USB-C. Did Apple wait too long? The European Union mandate is for the end of 2024 deadline, but they're going now. What impact will that have?
It makes it easier for people that are within the ecosystem. It's one less cable, but as Mark was talking about, for the Pro version, if it does do the higher data it's nicer for creators, right? It's actually useful. It's not just about doing the mandate for the requirement. It'd be interesting to see how they spin the story because we all been waiting, and from a portfolio perspective, the iPad has it, but the phone does it. And so you start to see, discrepancies within the portfolio. Now we have one cable across the board. I'm sure that the AirPods will also get a new case with the USB-C.
I am all in on one cable. Carolina, tell me a little bit about how they're going to spin the green element. You just took us there a little bit, the sustainability narrative. Feels as though that's going to creep into the watches as well.
It seems so with materials, and there's been a lot of speculation about abandoning leather, both with their own bands and with the relationship with Hermes. And I think that if you look at Apple's DNA around sustainability, they always had a very strong story. They have a goal to be carbon neutral by 2030 across their supply chain and products. They are already carbon neutral for their own operations already today. And so it'd be interesting to see whether the material is one aspect of it. We saw the badges today are all recycled. There's no plastic in today's events badges. So it seems like sustainability is definitely going to be a story.
What about the watch in general? How much are they continuing to want to innovate on that particular product? How important is it to them?
It's a very important product to them just because health and fitness is an important story to tell, and they have made a huge impact. It's been interesting to see how much the Ultra version of the watch has taken consumers by storm. It's not just for the fitness. When we were talking about this actually on the program and said there's a lot of wannabes health and fitness people that will buy this watch. So for Apple is another way to lock customers in, and I know that they hate that term, but it's true. If you have your phone and your watch, it's harder for you to move away and move to a different brand and ecosystem.
Carolina, the company story for Apple has really been China. Yes. In the June quarter, it was a record in Greater China, 8% growth when there was overall decline. How important is this iPhone 15 for that market? Does it get traction with the consumer in China?
It's very important, and I think the story about the processor for the Maxes and the Pro is important for China. China has always been a market that is more about real technology, and so processors is something that they look at very closely versus design and materials. So I think that separating that Pro line with a different processor, with a dedicated processor that can give you more, is going to be really critical for China.
Carolina Minnelesi, Creative Strategies Principal Analyst. This is a strong start, Caro, to our special coverage for Bloomberg Technology of Apple's iPhone event.
Brilliant with you on the ground there, Ed. Let's get back to what's happening in trading more broadly, because actually it's a bit of a risk-off day around the Apple wait-and-see mode. Of course, some earnings that come and stump the market. We're off by 0.5%. Interestingly, in the commodity space, we're seeing a drive higher, oil on the higher side. OPEC saying, look, we've got a tight market. I'm looking at what's happening in Bitcoin, though. Actually higher versus the US dollar on the moment. We're seeing it up by some 4%, so volatility back a little bit with Bitcoin. Move over and see what's happening on individual micro levels, though. And I want to draw attention not only what's happening into, of course, of Apple shares off by 0.75%. PayPal getting a bid, tightening its relationship with Uber, going to be expanding that payment processing. But I'm looking at Oracle. This is the other story of the day. It is down the most. I had to triple check. The most since 2002. This is as this company is saying, look, 30% revenue growth in the cloud. It's not good enough. They wanted to see more in terms of the overall analyst community and the investor base. We sink hard and it drags a lot of other names to the downside. But back to Apple in a moment. This is Bloomberg Technology. Let's talk about Google facing its biggest antitrust challenge yet over accusations it's maintained a monopoly over the search market via, of course, those agreements with tech rivals. The company facing a pair of lawsuits by the US Justice Department and state attorneys general that could result in perhaps even the breakup of the 25-year-old search giant. For more, let's bring in Jennifer Reed, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Litigation Analyst, who's been listening in already to some opening statements. Does this feel reminiscent to the 90s?
You know, it does. It really does. And there's so many parallels being brought to the big, huge case against Microsoft that I think we all know about. And the thing is, it is similar. You know, there are allegations. You know, Microsoft was entering into agreements to try to block out Netscape and Java. And the allegation here is that Google's entering agreements to try to block out rivals like Bing and DuckDuckGo, other companies that people would use to search the internet, right? So there are a lot of similarities there, but there are also some very big differences because of what these tech companies have learned from the Microsoft case.
And to that end, the argument's going to be coming from Alphabet, the parent company of Google. Are they in any way going to diverge from basically what we learned in the 90s?
Yeah, I think so. Look, they're going to say, we've done nothing to prevent anybody from using Bing or DuckDuckGo to search the internet. You know, in Microsoft's case, it made it very difficult for anybody using a Microsoft PC to download and use Netscape, right, as a browser. They technically made it difficult. You could not do it. But in this case, actually, it's quite easy to change your default search engine. Google may have that agreement to start as the default when you buy your device, but you can go in and change your device. So it's questionable as to whether is this really foreclosing Google competitors or isn't it? And so we're going to have to see how that testimony comes out about how sticky it is to be the default, how much users actually do switch back and forth.
And isn't it interesting that it's coming all at this moment where we're suddenly thinking the monopoly is under attack from ChatGPT-4, the idea that AI is really the competitor of choice now?
You know, the interesting thing about technology is that the markets can change so quickly and so drastically, you know, and this is one of the things that all the tech companies will claim. Look, I may have a monopoly now, but this could change any day, and we're always trying to hold on to our position. And technology changes, and you really can't judge it sort of the way the antitrust laws are judging it right now. You know, you have to think about ChatGPT. I tend to think ChatGPT is a bigger threat to Google, actually, Google search, than this particular trial.
Interesting. Jennifer Reed, we're so pleased to have her here from Bloomberg Intelligence. And look, we want to dig into the legal ramifications a little bit more, the arguments being set forth with Rebecca Allensworth, Professor of Law over at Vanderbilt. It is wonderful to have your perspective here, Rebecca. And the track record thus far of the government in the antitrust cases, it ain't been good. I mean, are you bracing yourself that perhaps they could land this one?
Well, all antitrust trials are really hard to win, and this is no different. The government's arguments are good, and I think that if they have a chance of winning in any case, they have a chance of winning in this one. I do take issue with the idea that their track record has been bad. It's true that they've lost a lot of cases in terms of the final outcome, but along the way, there have been some important holdings that I think actually vindicate the current enforcement attitude that the FTC and the DOJ is taking.
Let's dwell on that a little bit, because this isn't just about winning individual fights, but it's about sort of changing the narrative, the leaning of how future FTCs as well and future administrations might just tackle big tech. Do you think that has changed?
I think it has. I mean, there's a case from about 15 years ago, actually involving Google, in which the court said that there cannot be any antitrust harm in a market for which consumers don't pay for the product. And that just is not likely to be the holding in this case, because we've realized that free products aren't really so free. So that's just one example of how, yeah, it's changed over time.
In terms of the technicalities of this particular case, how do you think the arguments will land thus far when you're hearing of the 10 billion being paid by Google to maintain basically key relationships with phone makers? How do you think the alternatives are going to land coming from Google?
Well, I think that they have some strong arguments too, honestly. So they're going to argue two things. They're going to say, first of all, we are big not because we have these exclusive dealing contracts, but we're big because we're better. Consumers have voted. That's what competition is supposed to do. And we won. We're the best search engine. They're also going to say that these are not actually exclusive dealing contracts. Competition is just a click away. This, I think, is a less strong argument. And I do think this is a lot like the argument made in the Microsoft case. But kind of put together, there's an intuition that, consumers really like Google. They're not downloading Bing and DuckDuckGo to their phones, and that's competition. So that will be hard to overcome for the government.
We're looking at a year-to-date chart of Alphabet shares right now, up 54%. It doesn't feel as though the investor and analyst community are particularly fretting over some sort of big breakup or impact to the overall revenue streams of this business. That's largely about where artificial intelligence takes us. But for the here and the now, Rebecca, do you think that some sort of risk does need to be factored in? How do you think that people are bracing themselves?
So I think as far as market risk, I don't know that this trial poses a huge risk to Google's bottom line. And that's for a few different reasons. First of all, I think that they're more likely than not to win. I think that maybe speaks to the weakness of our antitrust laws. But the other thing is Google is big and Google is dominant for reasons other than these exclusive dealing contracts. I think a breakup is unlikely. I think even if the government wins, what they're going to get is an injunction against these contracts. And it's a small piece of why Google is so dominant. I think this trial matters more for precedent and for antitrust law and for what it means for the rest of tech.
Rebecca, really great to get your expertise. We thank you so much, Rebecca Allensworth, Vanderbilt Law School professor. This one's going to roll on, so I have a feeling we'll be inviting her back. Meanwhile, coming up, look, cage matches. They've become part of a technology show much more than I ever envisaged. But let's have a look at WWE and the UFC today, combining as a public entity, trading on the New York Stock Exchange. I'm going to be discussing it all with Endeavor COO Mark Shapiro. That's next. This is Bloomberg Technology. Time now for Talking Tech. First up, Arm, preparing for the biggest IPO of the year, and its CEO is pitching investors with a bit of a pivot. Instead of focusing on chips for smartphones and other electronics that sell for pennies, Arm is doing complex design work, it says, focused on specific products tailored for what it sees as a key area of growth, of course, largely being AI. Currently, its listing is oversubscribed by 10 times. Plus, Alibaba will put artificial intelligence and user experience at the top of its priorities as its new leadership seeks to reclaim customers and indeed market share. CEO Eddie Wu laid out his vision in a memo to staff, stressing its approach to go AI first, while not forgetting the hundreds of millions of users that help create one of China's largest corporations. And senators here in America will question the nation's top technology leaders as Congress confronts threats posed by what they see as a rapid rise of artificial intelligence. Tomorrow, it's going to be a closed-door inaugural AI forum. You're going to see these two gentlemen, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, also Sundar Pichai, and others who are going to be attending to answer questions and concerns of the burgeoning technology. Meanwhile, talking of those two individuals, Zuck and Musk, remember we were all talking about cage matches? Well, we're talking also fighting more broadly, the billions of money it brings in. Endeavor today completing its takeover of WWE and combining it with UFC to create a publicly traded fighting machine called TKO. That's technical knockout, being the boxing term. Now, earlier I discussed the news with Endeavor and now TKO's COO and president, that's Mark Shapiro. And this is what he talked about in terms of competition. Take a listen.
The market completely overreacted last week because ultimately PIF came out and said they were going to make a $100 million investment in the PFL. And you know what? We're fans of the PFL. We're fans of any entity that supports MMA for the UFC. Rising tide lifts all boats on this front. And the UFC is where everybody wants to get to. I mean, the UFC is really the NFL of combat sports. So we welcome it. I think the overreaction was really about fighter pay. If there's more and more competition and there's more and more brands coming to the table, is fighter pay going to get out of control and hurt UFC's margins? And it couldn't be farther from the truth, because the real growth of UFC, the revenue growth, has been driven by high margin revenue streams, such as our media deals and sponsorships. And at the end of the day, any fighter pay increase can be absorbed by the increases we're seeing in those revenue streams and results still in margin accretion.
Let's talk about the board that, of course, you said that you're going to be controlling, but there's a bit of a key man risk with being McMahon himself of WWE. How do you see that and his real dedication as executive chair to the overall TKO?
He's very similar to Dana White. I mean, Vince McMahon is very similar. He's a founder, he's a pioneer, he's an innovator, he's a hard charger, he's got unbelievable relationships, and he's grown this sport from nothing to be the global behemoth that it is. So I welcome him being executive chairman. Ari and I are very excited to partner with him. And just in the early days, while we haven't been able to kind of get in there and really integrate, we've already seen a willingness to do that. Terrific communication, terrific collaboration, and I think Vince really recognizes the areas of business he has under-monetized, or his team is under-monetized, and that's why the merger, the partnership here, because we can teach them something, meaning UFC and Endeavor, and WWE can surely teach us something. And at the end of the day, 1 + 1 = 5.
He's been subpoenaed, though. Is there a legal risk?
What I would say on that is, federal law enforcement and regulatory agencies, they are doing their investigations, and there will be due process, and we're not going to get involved in that. We'll stand by, we'll listen, we'll take our cues. He'll be executive chairman, he'll do his day job, and if somebody else tells us something we need to do differently or pivot, course correct, we will.
And let's talk about coursing and charting a course in this economic environment where you are seemingly very excited by the opportunities to monetize, to get more brands in. But look, brands are scared to spend money right now. The economy is volatile, to say the least. How do you see that?
What I see in that is the 30-second spot. Traditional ad budgets are certainly being compromised. But from an activation standpoint, an experiential standpoint, which is where we sit, right? We have 350 events annually. We have 1 billion fans. We have 1 billion social followers. Advertisers want access to those fans.
Meanwhile, we've got to talk Apple once again. We're going to be joined by Mirabel Lopez, founder and principal analyst of Lopez Research. Her take on what to expect from the key event. This is Bloomberg Technology. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Caroline Hyde in New York. We are going to check in on these markets on the all-important day ahead of CPI print for macro, day of micro news when it comes to Apple. Looking at the NASDAQ 100, just off about 2/3 of a percentage point. There is some nervousness out there regarding some of the big macro headwinds and indeed, well, some of the read across from earnings that I'll dig into in a moment. Bitcoin, though, actually getting a bit of a push higher at almost 5% on the upside, 26,300. And remember, there's a lot of volatility in overall crypto as we anticipate whether there'll be FTX sales. But we also think that Franklin Templeton seems to be adding its weight into the rush to get a spot Bitcoin ETF, adding a little bit of, well, moon music to the upside on Bitcoin. I'm looking at Bloomberg Commodity Index up 0.1% despite a stronger dollar today. That's more about the strength of oil and OPEC saying they're seeing these tight markets. Let's move on from the macro to the micro pictures. I want to shine a light on what's happening with Oracle. As I said, having its worst day since 2002. We're off by 12%. We see revenue growth not living up to expectations. They actually put in 30% increase in terms of cloud revenue, but the market wanted higher. We're seeing also Intel on the upside, actually divesting some stakes in a nanofabricator in particular, IMS, and we're seeing it, well, 10% stake being offloaded. That makes the shares just rise about 2%. They're selling it to TSMC. And I'm looking, lastly, at Apple. Maybe there's the question of how much we're still worried about the headwinds of China. We're worried about the chip implications of still having to turn to Qualcomm. Ed, we're off by 1.5% as we anticipate those big unveils over there where you are in California.
Yeah, these Apple events are always a bar is high for the market moment, right? There's been 12 iPhone launch events going back to 2011. On the day, the stocks ended up down 9 out of 12. So that's kind of the precedent that's set. There's so much more to recap. With 30 minutes from the start of Apple's Wonderlust event, where we're expecting 4 variants of the next-gen iPhone 15. Let's keep the conversation going. Maribel Lopez Research Principal Analyst, joining us on Bloomberg Technology right now. One thing we haven't quite talked about is the camera upgrade on the Pro and Pro Max. Historically, camera upgrades are important. How important are they this time around for Apple?
While predictable, they're a very popular feature with consumers. They're looking for better cameras, and this time we have the opportunity to get a hardware-based sensor option combined with AI software, so we expect it's going to be a big leap in performance, and perhaps what all the Wonderlust is all about.
Caroline and I have been very busy for the last 7 days talking about what's happening in China. Bloomberg reported that China's central government is expanding a clampdown on the use of foreign handsets, in particular iPhone, for government agencies and state-backed enterprises. Is that a concern ahead of a big launch of a next-gen iPhone for Apple?
You know, we see it still posturing right now. We think it's a long way from a wholesale ban on Apple tech in China, but it is concerning because it starts with the government and then it could roll into government-owned companies or government, shall we say, government-controlled companies. So there's a lot of opportunity and risk associated with this right now, but I think it's still too early to call it as an issue for iPhone sales in the near term.
In the near term, then, is the US economy an issue? Or do you think that everyone is willing to continue to pay up for a more high-functioning and indeed lighter device, even though the price point just keeps on getting higher?
I think where we are in the market right now is that Apple is really targeting a premium consumer, an aspirational consumer, and they are still willing to pay for these device upgrades. We're expecting that there's going to be a price increase on the Pro Max, but we also expect that that premium aspirational buyer will be willing to pay that. The real risk for Apple is if they do not have a set of smaller, cheaper product category, do they cede share to someone else in the market? And I think their perspective is, we don't really care. We want the premium buyer. We want the higher margin.
Okay, what about, the competitive space that is wearables as well? How much focus do we give the watch in the announcements?
I think the watch is something that we have continued to wait for that big bang on, and it's only broken through a certain set of the consumer base. What I do think will happen is that watch buyers are very attracted to this product and will continue to buy upgrades to this product because it is part of their overarching health and fitness goal. The big question is, can we get new markets into it? They've made a play for the elder population, and a lot of people have bought these devices for their family members. We still see opportunity there. There is still actually opportunity for the wearable in the workplace, particularly as we look at first-line workers, where it can actually provide quite a bit of health and safety. We've really not seen any penetration in that market, so it could be that 2024 is the year that we start to see the watch get better enterprise play as well.
Maribel, the kind of other bucket of things we expect are a move to USB-C, USB-C going into the Pro AirPods, and then some kind of, the watch changes that we just outlined. How much importance do you place on the other bucket that we just talked about?
I think the other bucket is a nice to have. They'd still sell the products without the USB-C, but having said that, there are regulations that have been proposed that they need to address. And if you're going to do it in one region, you have to do that in all regions. We think it's going to be really good for consumers. It's really going to open up the ecosystem to a wide range of companies that already have USB-C product. So that is going to be good for Apple and good for the people that build around the smartphone, smartwatch ecosystem.
Maribel, there's a piece of data. It's been stuck in my head for a few days now. Tim Cook talked about several quarters of slowdown in the US smartphone market, 3 straight quarters of sales declines for Apple. But if you look at IDC, in that period, particularly the second quarter, they grew market share, even in a market that's pulling back against Samsung. What does that tell you, Apple's ability to gain market share?
They've had tremendous resilience in what's been looking like a major smartphone slowdown / smartphone winter, similar to what we've seen in the PC market. There could be double-digit declines that continue on. But what we're seeing happening with Apple is the strength of the Apple ecosystem in terms of the applications and in terms of the cool factor has really kept them in this more resilient position. We expect that since they're the only provider of iOS software right now, that they're going to have strength through the next several quarters, despite it being a difficult market. Perhaps not as strong as we would all like to see them perform, but I still think they'll do well compared to the market at large.
Maribel, do they need to remind us of the Vision Pro and the cool factor there?
They do, but the reality is it still seems like that being a market that's going to really add top line and bottom line dollars to Apple is still quite a few quarters away. I think they'll talk about it so that they can keep the momentum alive and get people thinking about it for 24 buys, but I'm not sure it's going to be a big year for that this coming year.
And lastly, I mean, what everyone has waited for a void to be filled by Apple is what they're going to be doing about artificial intelligence, how they're going to be interweaving that within its services. You really talk about the power of the Apple ecosystem. Within that, I think fintech, but I also think Siri, and I think about the ways that ultimately generative AI might up the ante. Are you waiting for that moment?
I think we're already starting to see that moment. We're seeing it in software that's being built. We're seeing it in the chipsets that Apple provides. And back on the earlier discussion about the chipset, this has been a big push and concern for Apple. And being able to control at least some of the hardware behind that allows them to be better positioned to actually embrace this Gen AI wave that is really rushing over us at this point in time. So I think that they'll have a strong showing in AI-related products as a result of the power of the processor. And it's one of the things that keeps the phone expensive, but it's also one of the things that keeps the phone interesting.
Maribel Lopez, founder and principal analyst of Lopez Research. Great to have your take there. And Ed, isn't it interesting that Maribel ends her point on it keeps on allowing them to up the price point, but it makes it more interesting. Ed.
Yeah, if you're Dan Ives of Wedbush, you point to 250 million old generation iPhones around the world that are due for upgrade, and that drives volumes. If you're Anurag Rana at Bloomberg Intelligence, our analyst, he would say, look at prices. iPhone 14 Pro is $999 US. What if Apple prices the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max incrementally higher or substantively higher than that? Are those kind of first adopters that Carolina Milanese was talking about, are they willing to spend at that price point?
And to that point, what does it do for the overarching average selling point? Does it mean that we still see people gravitating to those pros? Do they then decide, actually, I can forsake a bit of an upgrade in my camera here and indeed perhaps some speed to the chip. I would rather hold on out. I maybe just wait until I can get an iPhone 15 on this particular generation. I don't know, Ed. The people you're speaking to in California, I feel that they're early adopters. They're going to be in no matter what, right?
Yeah. Yeah, they focus on the technology. So the processor has faster speeds, more memory added. But the other benefit is better battery life or battery performance, which for everyone watching this program, let's all agree, battery life on iPhone is key.
Yeah, Mr. Two Phones Ed. I'm sure you can agree. Meanwhile, coming up, look, we're going to have a bit of a book club moment. We're going to take a pass from Apple just for a split second and discuss 2 new books detailing the thoughts and actions made by, some pretty polarizing figures. Sam Bankman-Fried, Elon Musk. Stay tuned. This is Bloomberg Technology. It feels an age ago, but boy, the collapse of Sam Bankman-Fried's FTX, it sent shockwaves throughout the crypto market, and it rather lined up in time for a new book called Number Go Up. It's inside crypto's wild rise and staggering fall. Bloomberg's investigative reporter Zeke Fox goes down basically an entire rabbit hole to learn more about digital tokens, lesser known mechanics of the industry. And well, Zeke, am I fair in saying that you came back kind of underwhelmed by the whole situation? It felt as though it was just funny, raucous, absurd, but at times pretty shocking. Remind us how it all began.
So I started out like a lot of people, just FOMO. Like I saw my friends getting big scores on Dogecoin, Solana, like whatever. I thought the whole thing was kind of annoying. It seemed dumb, but I got sucked in. I decided to investigate, and I found myself on like this crazy adventure. And by 2 years later, I was in Cambodia investigating crypto-fueled human trafficking. And then I was at Sam Bankman-Fried's penthouse in the Bahamas just before the cops showed up. So even though I resisted, I was glad I went down the crypto rabbit hole.
I can imagine when you start to ascribe writings around human trafficking that those are the moments as a journalist you need but don't always want. I mean, what was the really dark underbelly of what was happening in the crypto world?
So you always hear things about like, oh, crypto might be used for money laundering or other illicit purposes. But what I found is that there are whole like office parks in Cambodia, in southwestern Cambodia, where there's like floor after floor of people who are working around the clock under threat of beatings and torture, sending spam text messages to people in richer countries, trying to trick them into investing in crypto and other like crypto and gambling scams.
Was there any repercussion from that? Are you starting to see, I mean, ultimately we had to see a blow up of gargantuan proportions for regulators, for people to start to become involved and dig more deeply on what ultimately was the FTX showdown. But what about human trafficking in Cambodia? Who is looking at that?
Yeah, so it's starting to get more attention from like Interpol, the UN. It's like an international issue. But within the crypto world, like when I was it's been sort of ignored. Like when I went to go talk to Sam Bankman-Fried for the last time at his apartment when things were blowing up, I was like, have you read about any of this? Like, do you realize that some of these criminals are sending money like to your exchange? And he's like, like that sounds bad.
So go into his psyche. Like, obviously you saw him at probably the most extraordinary moment, but what do you think his overwhelming drive was? Because we've got to remember the trial is happening relatively soon and he's still deeming himself, not guilty.
So when I met him, I was fascinated by this idea that like when he was a teenager, he was like, I want to do something good for the world. Somebody convinced him the best thing to do would be to get rich. And then like 10 years later, at least on paper, he's one of the richest guys in the world. And some people think that like it was all a lie, he was a monster the whole time. I actually think that this drive, this belief in his own self-righteousness led him to take insane risks and led him to where he is today.
Hubris. I mean, ultimately, the reason crypto is sort of like a media gift that keeps on giving and an extraordinary rabbit hole for you to have gone down is sort of celebrity meets vast quantities of cash meets overnight success meets ridiculous acronyms all sort of bombarded into one. There's a lot of schadenfreude. There's a lot of like, all these celebrities who lost vast amounts on NFTs. But I mean, you bought a Bored Ape at one point. I mean, how do you think this ends up playing out? Ultimately, everyone loses money?
I mean, anyone who's seen like the last couple of years, if you've paid any attention, it's hard to say like, oh, let's run it all back. Like, let's wait for the next cycle. I think that's pretty unlikely. But it was pretty fun to be a part of it this last time. And yeah, buying a Bored Ape, I got to go to Ape Fest, which was like a week-long party for people who owned these $100,000 ugly cartoon JPEGs.
But that's loyalty, right? That's creating a club. You think that's dead entirely?
The party cost, I mean, for 20 grand, you got to go mill around with a bunch of drunk dudes. I did get to confront Jimmy Fallon about the investment advice that he'd given these people. So for me, I think I was happy I went, but I think most people are going to be more mad about all the money they're losing than happy about, they got to see Amy Schumer tell some jokes about NFTs.
Maybe Jimmy Fallon wasn't so pleased you were there either, but Zeke, I'm glad you were there. And to tell the story, what an amazing read. Just go read it. He's always got some incredible anecdotes and really deep, thoughtful, important reporting. Zeke Fox, we thank him. Number go up. It's now available for purchase. Meanwhile, let's talk about another key book you might be wanting to look at, the biography about Elon Musk. It's shedding light about, his often dismissive behavior when given advice by powerful advisors. Walter Isaacson's Elon Musk comes out this week too. Bloomberg News social media reporter Aisha Counts, you had a deep dive on it. Anything particularly shocking in there as someone who covers the ins and outs of Elon Musk day in, day out?
When you start to cover Elon Musk, you realize you shouldn't be shocked by anything, right? Expect everything. But there were a few anecdotes and details that I thought were interesting. So he had more advisors than I had initially realized. So people like David Zaslav from Warner Brothers Discovery advised him and was saying, hey, you're kind of engaging in some self-destructive behaviors that are not helping advertisers want to spend money on your platform. And they had about an hour-long conversation about that. And he was like, you should focus on video. You should make your ads better. I think Musk kind of ignored that because he continued to send out tweets and things that kind of irked advertisers. But it was interesting that I didn't know that Zaslav advised him at that point.
I mean, 95 chapters and 600 pages. How much of this is about leadership style? How much of this is going to sort of inform us about what apparently could well be happening within the businesses he runs at the moment?
I mean, I think it gives you some sense of how he is as a leader, right? There's a lot of stories and details of Musk kind of going out and taking charge or making erratic decisions, which we all kind of thought he was doing that and sort of knew from what he was doing with like Twitter, which is now X, or other companies. But you really start to see kind of behind the scenes how many people were saying, hey, maybe you shouldn't do that, right? Even down to his own brother was like, I don't know if you should tweet that, and was not able to sleep at night because he was worried about what Elon might tweet. So you start to see details like that there were more people in his inner circle that were sort of advising him, and Musk kind of just made his own decisions.
And to that point, Aisha, does it therefore drive an investor base looking for dedication, someone who is completely hands at the wheel, to pardon a pun, of Tesla, ensuring that he is doing what he needs to be doing when it comes to an incredibly valuable private company that is SpaceX?
I mean, it's a good question, right? I think investors are probably mixed. I think it sounds like some, right, especially some venture capitalists that he's close to, like David Sachs or Andreessen, liked that Musk sort of was willing to break the rules and go out and do things that people said couldn't be done. And then other people were like, I don't want to deal with this. He's too erratic, and I can't trust what decision he's going to make. Like the chair of Tesla at one point was like, hey, we're concerned about how your work on Twitter and X is distracting from what you should be doing at Tesla. And I'm sure SpaceX investors felt the same. So it's a mix.
It's a mix. And of course, he's got XAI as well to be taken under his wing. Aisha Counts, really fascinating deep dive on the book that many are going to be eyeing up. We thank you. Meanwhile, coming up, look, we've got to go back to Cupertino. Live at the Apple Wanderlust event, our own Ed Ludlow has the latest ahead of the all-important unveil. From New York, from San Francisco, this is Bloomberg Technology. The Apple Wanderlust event starts in, just a few minutes' time, 1 p.m. Eastern time, 6 minutes from now, Ed. You're live there in Cupertino. Getting exciting?
Yeah, I'm getting excited. You know, this is a big event. It actually feels like a much bigger event than WWDC when we got the Vision Pro. And it kind of makes sense, right? Remember, WWDC is on the developer side. This is about iPhone. $200 billion of sales last year, 50% of revenue. It touches people all over the world. We know what's coming. 4 variants of the iPhone 15. What we don't know is about pricing. Like, what if they raise prices in a big way?
And whether people want to be going to that average selling price. Because it's interesting, isn't it? It dovetails at a moment where they've been looking for new types of buyers, a middle class growing in India.
Yes.
But also that speaks to the supply chain changes that we see at hand as well.
This was really important Bloomberg reporting overnight. According to our sources, this will be the first launch where an India-assembled iPhone will hit the market in India and other markets around the world straight away. Traditionally, it's made in China, and then 6 to 9 months later, the lowest spec base models of iPhone start production in Foxconn facilities in India. What we're hearing from sources is they're accelerating that, starting straight away in India, which speaks to the supply chain story.
And maybe just shows the focus on diversifying a consumer base that at the moment we potentially see headwinds coming, particularly in the Chinese buyer at the moment as well. Ed, you're going to be telling this global story, but it's an investor-based story, it's a revenue-driven story, and we're going to be all across it because coming up, we've got our coverage continuing. It's a Bloomberg Technology extended special edition. We're going to be focused on, guess what? Apple, as we count you down to the annual product launch just a few minutes away. We're going to be live right here from New York, right over there in Cupertino. And this really is a focus on a raft of products, the high end, the pros, the maxes, the overall 15s, what they're going to have on offer, the cameras, the chips, what goes into them, and indeed a fair focus on the smartwatch too. From New York, this is Bloomberg Technology.
Heart of where innovation, money, and power collide in Silicon Valley and beyond. This is Bloomberg Technology with Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow.
Caroline Hyde of Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York.
And I'm Ed Ludlow here in Cupertino, Apple Campus, the Steve Jobs Theatre behind me. This, Caro, is a special Bloomberg Technology and everything iPhone at Apple's Wanderlust event.
And everything change of cord, USB, and everything focus on AirPods, on the watch as well. We have got so much to drive forward, as well as some of those headwinds when it comes to China, when it comes to supply chain, when it comes to those all-important chips that I know you love so much. Ed, we've got the perfect person to be setting us up into all of this. Bloomberg's Tom Giles joins us for really already what we anticipate. Mark Gurman just comes out with really a fully fledged view of what we're going to be delivered. The point is how much importance this is to an investor base, Tom.
Are you hearing me? Yes. Say that again, Caroline.
Yeah, Tom, what are you thinking about in terms of how important this moment is to the investors as well as the consumers?
Yeah, this is a huge moment for Apple. This company, there's been a lot of anticipation for this event. But this year, it's particularly high, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, we expect this to be a major upgrade in a lot of areas. Camera, chip. This is Apple's most important device, and they are going for the gusto here. There is a lot of upgrades. There's a lot of changes. This is a major one. This is not incremental. So in that regard, this is hugely important. And remember, the backdrop here is a decline in global smartphone demand. And that's something that Apple is really having to fight against.
I think we're having a few technical issues at the moment, Tom, but I just want to drive it home with you a little bit more in terms of we understand the power of the iPhone. We understand the $200 billion it brings in terms of revenue per year. I'm interested in, ultimately, with a price point that may well rise, how much can they really ensure a consumer will go there, Tom? I think we've lost Tom Giles, unfortunately. But, Ed, I think at the moment in Cupertino, there's going to be a lot of excitement, a lot of people waiting with bated breath for the upgrades. And we've got a perfect guest to be sort of driving that conversation forward.
Yeah, and hey, I'll remind our audience that there's a reason Apple pre-records this presentation and then plays it out later to get rid of those technical issues. Absolutely delighted to be joined here at Apple Campus by Annette Zimmerman, Gartner analyst. And, you know, Annette, we've gone through all the specs we're expecting. Lots of focus on the higher end Pro and Pro Max, updated silicon, updated camera. For you, what is most important to return Apple to growth?
Yeah, so I mean, at the moment, it's of course still a little bit speculation what we will see, and I think there's going to be some kind of feature that we haven't heard about yet because it's called Wanderlust, right? The event. So wonder, or merging the word wonder with Wanderlust, which means literally translated to be the desire to travel, and I think we all have this desire to travel. Since the pandemic, and that we have most of it behind us. So I think there's going to be something around certain sensors that will make workout and traveling and just moving around even more precise and more accurate and more engaging, basically. So I think there's going to be lots of around new precise sensors and these kind of things.
The event is underway, and in the early stages they're showing video with people using older generation of iPhone, older generation of the watch in the real world. But iPhone seems to be everything. Just explain to our audience how important the refresh cycle is for Apple, every new generation of iPhone that they release.
Yeah, so Apple targets obviously different user groups. So one user group is the early adopters that usually upgrade their phone maybe every 2 years and sometimes even every year. So that is usually the group that they target with their very high-end devices. But then you also have a very loyal user group that is more in the mid-range and maybe more on the budget side. That sometimes they upgrade only after 5 years. As long as you can upgrade the operating system, and I think especially it's going to be, or this event is usually around the higher end and the mid-range type of devices and the users. And for those users that maybe wait a little bit longer for upgrading. Apple also has some interesting price offers, usually with those that that come or that have been introduced earlier in the year, so or last year maybe even. So so all of this will be important. It's the whole thing about Apple targeting these different user groups, but also really paying attention to these different segments and try to make them happy.
Yes. You are watching Bloomberg Technology's special coverage of Apple's Wonderlust event. We're expecting iPhone 15. Annette Zimmerman, Gartner analyst, with me. And in the early stages, the presentation started, we're a couple of minutes in. They've been talking about how Apple devices help consumers and users in medical emergency situations. At the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned sensor technology. We know that there are some updates to watch coming, but talk about that healthcare segment and indeed the emergency case scenario with Apple.
Yeah. So at WWDC, we saw some really interesting developments with iOS and the ability to, to support people with their physical health, but also with their mental health, right? And so we're seeing Apple expanding significantly into different areas. So it's about our behavior, our health, our mental health, our physical health that will, I think, is part of our everyday life, and we need to embrace it, and we need to, or we can use specifically the Apple devices to support us in our journey for health.
I can confirm that Tim Cook is now speaking on stage, and he said that he's going to be talking about Apple Watch and iPhone. Not really surprising. One thing that's going to impact consumers everywhere is the move to USB-C. It's a European Union mandate, deadline end of 2024. What effect will that have for Apple switching to USB-C?
It has a big effect on Apple because well, they obviously had to make technical and physical changes to the design and to, basically to the entire roadmap of devices that will be coming. And there will be more on top of that will be made, or changes will be made because the EU is also looking for better repairability of devices. So and Apple has to invest in new designs to make those devices more repairable, and also make spare parts available, make it affordable available to users, so you can do your own repair if you want, these kind of things. But that impacts Apple and the entire industry, really.
Tim Cook is using these early stages to talk about WWDC June, the M2 chip, Ultra chip that went into the 15-inch MacBook Air, Mac Studio, Mac Pro, basically saying the feedback and response has been fantastic. We will see if the feedback or response is as good for this next generation of iPhone, which is what we will focus on most. Annette Zimmerman, Gartner analyst, so good to have you here in real time during this Apple Wonderlust event. Caroline, back to you in New York.
I know, so great to have the on-the-feeling sense of this moment. And actually, we're hearing from Tim Cook as well, saying, look, Apple is still on track to ship its Vision Pro in early 2024. Now we are still anticipating the announcements regarding the watch, the AirPods, the new ways in which you're going to be charging them through the USB, and indeed what we're waiting on the iPhone 15 range. But let's go back to Tom Giles, of course. And Tom, this is about consumer awe, but it's also about investor reality. And at this moment, they've got plenty of headwinds. We're worried about Chinese consumer. We're worried about supply chain as well. How do you think they managed to tackle or offset that narrative at this moment?
Yeah, and don't forget, they've also got Huawei in the mix. Huawei out with a new phone, with a new operating system, and gathering a lot of momentum behind it. So there's a lot that they have to do here today to prove that this is a really special upgrade. As we were talking about earlier, this isn't your average instance where they're adding a few things, they're iterating around the edges. There are some substantial changes. If you talk to Mark Gurman, he will tell you that this is a major set of upgrades. And that's what Apple is doing to really take the attention off the competitive threat, the pressure from the Chinese government on using the iPhone in that country, the pressure from Huawei, all of it. This is Tim Cook's moment to take your attention off of that and show once again that we're adding really special features to the iPhone, the faster chip. Again, this telephoto lens with the camera that's letting you take these up-close these up-close photos with the iPhone, things you can't do with other devices. This is his moment to remind people we're doing things that are really special with this camera. And it's really important because it makes up half of the company's revenue.
And to be fair, like, analysts still seem convinced by all of that at the moment, Tom. I'm looking at 35 buy ratings. That's 2/3 of all the analysts out there rate this stock a buy. And in fact, there's still about 15% upside potential if you're looking at a price target consensus of 204. But we have had this sort of knock to the overall market capitalization of Apple over the last few trading days. And ultimately, how important is the fact that they can nudge us up on a price point? How resilient does the US consumer need to be at this moment?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Apple has to walk a really fine line, right, with the way they price this device. And that's why they've got multiple devices that are going to be getting upgrades today. And exactly where are they going to tinker with pricing? How much do they add those high-end features to the lower-end devices? All of those things, this is the kind of thing that Apple spends a lot of time thinking about very strategically, and they tend to be very smart about it, not loading too much into the lower end devices so that they can still sell them at a little bit of a discount to the higher end devices. How do they keep those margins going in the right direction? And if you look at their gross margins, they're going in the right direction. So how does Apple do this, particularly at a time when you're seeing overall demand for smartphones globally dropping off? Q2 was a really tough quarter, both for the iOS, that's Apple, and Android, that's the Google operating system that's in so many global devices. Yeah. But something that Apple did in the second quarter was they weathered the storm better than Android. And that's what Tim Cook really wants to see Apple continue to do going forward.
Well, we'll have so much more from Tim Cook. From you, Tom, we thank you so much, all regarding this big unveil, where we understand that it is official, the S9 of the watch has arrived, and indeed it's got an S9 chip, so we're going to have some what they call major performance improvements overall. We understand that the COO, Jeff Williams, is on the stage at the moment introducing this next generation of the Apple Watch, and it's touting an improved performance overall, including the new chip, and calling it the most powerful Apple Watch chip to date. Now, we're going to be talking so much about the intricacies of this announcement with Ray Wang. He's the CEO and principal analyst of Constellation Research. His take on what is being announced at the Apple event. It's over in Cupertino. That's where our Ed Ludlow is too. This is Bloomberg Technology.
All right, the latest headlines coming out of this Apple Wanderlust event center on the next generation Apple Watch, the S9 or 9 series with an updated piece of silicon, S9 chip, 30% more powerful GPU. Caro, in terms of some of the things that this manifests itself with, dictation, 25% more accurate, 18 hours of battery life. Two ways of looking at it, that's all day battery life, although Mark Gurman posting in the Bloomberg Top Live blog that it's basically the same as prior generations. Also the ability to engage with Siri directly to the watch without latency in a more secure method. That's what they're leaning on with this latest watch. Yeah, more effective use of point. Also integration with the HomePod is an interesting one as well. But overall, new gesture control being integrated. They've got to be pushing really the way in which they're standing out from a crowded space when it comes to connected devices, the way in which we measure our health, Ed, because, well, many have been getting into the rings, the watches of other variations too. Yeah, something really cool they've just announced with this latest generation watch. Series 9 has gesture control. So with a one-handed gesture, you can engage with the watch. It's called double tap. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how needle moving that is, right? The ability to wave at one's wrist and a watch, but we will find out because there is somebody who definitely has a stronger perspective on this than you or I, and that is Ray Wang, Constellation CEO and principal analyst. Good to see you here in Cupertino. Based on what I've just reported for you on the Apple Watch Series 9, what do you make of that as quick reaction?
Yeah, welcome to the hometown, like Cupertino. I think the really important thing that's going on here is the important piece that they're going from silicon to chip, and they're using their silicon to manage the battery life. They're using the silicon to handle the AI capabilities, and all those are really important, especially when you think about what Apple's known for. They have full control of their ecosystem, and that starts with the silicon. And so they're showcasing that on the watch, and of course, I think we're all waiting to see if there are other things that are going to be monitored, right? Other health indicators that I think would drive other people to go to the Ultra, and of course to the Series 9 watch.
Yeah, the expectation is that we would have two size variants of Series 9, one new variant of the Ultra. These are the early exchanges of this event. Apple Wanderlust is underway behind us in the Steve Jobs Theatre, and you're right, we're waiting for 4 variants of the iPhone 15. How important is it that the hardware upgrades on the Pro side are substantive to drive an upgrade cycle?
Well, when we look at the entire upgrade cycle, we're talking about 1 billion iPhones that need to get 5G, right? And it's been happening over the next 3 years. And so as we're moving those in that super cycle, the big piece is really, is a telephoto lens potentially enough to get you there? The USB-C, got to do it because it's a regulatory requirement. Is it also going to be something around, is it a battery life? Is it a feature? Is it a service that's going to take people to that next level of using the iPhone? But the chips make a big difference. The battery life makes a big difference. And potentially a 48 megapixel camera may make that difference.
I want to go back to the watch for just a second. Some other information is the Series 9, let's call it the base model, has double the brightness, 2000 nits. That goes back to the last generation of Ultra. What is the strategy you see there from Apple? They're basically taking last year's tech and putting it into this year's base models.
Yeah, we're seeing things. If you want the Pro or the Ultra, you want the top level, you'll pay a little bit more for the new chip, and then you're going to see that gradation come into different markets. Let's take India, for example, right? The big talk about India. You might have different price points given where the demographics and the socioeconomics are. You'll have a different price point in the UK, of course, and you'll have a different price point if you're in the Middle East, right? Remember, Apple is at the heart a luxury brand, and because it's a luxury brand, that's what's driving that capability.
Right now on stage, Apple are talking about their environmental goals and the progress they've made in sustainability and materials. Is that an important factor for you?
It's important for me, especially when we think about circular economy and we think about how much energy is required to create a device, how you bring that back into it. Apple's been a leader, especially in sustainability and some of those ESG goals. And it goes from not just the battery, but it's also the materials and the recycling process. I've probably turned in, maybe you as well, turned in a couple phones in the past to do that. So.
Okay, forget what we've reported and what we think is coming. What do you want to see in these higher-end iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max?
Yeah, I think people are looking for better features. They're looking for experiences, for example, the ability to tie these to more devices. They're looking for the eventual integration between Mac OS, iOS, and Watch OS. And then, of course, they're trying to figure out, hey, maybe there's a sneak peek into Vision Pro and what's going to take us into Vision Pro as the replacement for the Mac. Like, that integration has always been an Apple fan's dream, right, to be able to bring all those things together.
Ray Wang, Constellation Research CEO and Principal Analyst, joining us in real time, Caroline, here in Cupertino. The Apple event is underway.
It is underway, and there's a focus on the environment, on sustainability, and we understand the latest headline is it's going to be phasing out its leather from its iPhone cases, and many had taken that cue from, moves over at Hermes of late. Coming up, we're going to have so much more coming for you. The analysis from Apple. Thomas Husson, he's Vice President and Principal Analyst over at Forrester Research, going to be joining the show live from Cupertino, from New York. We've got it all covered. This is Bloomberg Technology. And so we have the news coming from the Apple event in Cupertino, thick and fast. Of course, a Watch Series 9, going to be more powerful, swifter. We're going to be having the ability to, hand gesture to be able to wave fingers at it. Double tap is what it's called. Interoperability with your HomePod as well. Really, this is about being faster and more powerful. We're also seeing some more nuanced announcements around perhaps the wind down of any leather at the moment when it comes to being used in iPhone cases. So a push on sustainability. But we all await the iPhone 15 and the array that we get there. Forrester Research Vice President and Principal Analyst Thomas Husson is with us. And Thomas, you were expecting perhaps an ultra version of the watch. What more do you anticipate from the phone line up, and is it going to be enough?
Well, I'd expect a significant incremental innovation and improvements on the lineup of the, especially on the iPhone and the iPhone Pros. We've heard right now about some of the sustainability efforts. I think what would be very disruptive is to hear more of a device as a service offering where you have a bundle of hardware, content, and some circularity services, repairability. That would be a great step. I'm not sure we're going to hear that tonight, unfortunately. So is it going to be enough? I think Apple will maintain its leadership when it comes to smartphone innovation. The bigger question, I think, given the economic context, and we don't know yet, is going to be around pricing.
Precisely, and many anticipating that prices will rise. We're going to boost the average selling price. We're still focusing at the moment in terms on the environmental impact. Lisa Jackson, the EPA chief, saying about how by 2030 Apple devices will be net zero in impact. That was a Tim Cook ad as well. I'm interested in really the Huawei and Chinese perspective here as well, because there's been a lot of headwinds on Apple stock of late. Do you think that the innovation is enough at Apple to fight off the homegrown innovation of Huawei?
Well, I think so from a pure innovation standpoint. I think the bigger question is about the geopolitical context in China and the fact that indeed the iPhone has been banned to potentially dozens of millions of employees working in public state employees or for the government in China. What will be the consumer sentiment of Chinese consumers is a very big unknown, given the fact that the greater China represents about a fifth of Apple's revenue. So that might be another reason for a potential price up tag in other regions.
We keep an eye on the price point and indeed what we're going to hear when it comes to the new phones. Forrester Research Vice President and Principal Analyst Thomas Husson joining us on what we've so far been digesting. And it is a focus on the environment. Lisa Jackson, I misspoke earlier, of course, was a former EPA chief. Ed, Apple's head of environment now, really outlining the efforts. And Tim Cook saying by 2030, Apple devices will be and having a net zero impact. But give us the nitty gritty on what we got from at least connected devices and watches in particular, because many had braced for more.
Yeah, look, I think we probably got a more substantive upgrade to the Series 9 watch, the lower base model, than we thought we'd get. New silicon S9 chip, 30% better performance on the GPU side. But you're right, though, that real focus on the environmental side of this story. If you take Series 9 as an example, north of 80% of it is made of recycled materials. That includes some of the core metals like tungsten and copper. You know, and the pledge from Tim Cook is that by 2030, all devices will have net zero. So it's a commitment, but as our guests have made the point this whole show, it's about their supply chain and how they're adjusting to that.
Well, we'll see how that titanium comes into the mix in a moment. That's, of course, what's anticipated with the lineup of phones. You do not want to go anywhere. That does it for this special edition of Bloomberg Technology, live from Cupertino and from New York. But we're going to have full recaps throughout the remaining day. This is Bloomberg.